What if the perfect life you built was a beautiful, gilded cage, and you only discovered the bars when you were at your most vulnerable? Imagine being 8 months pregnant, walking into your millionaire husband's skyscraper office, ready to surprise him with lunch. But the surprise is on you. The woman sitting in his chair, feet propped up on his mahogany desk, isn't just a stranger. She's wearing a smirk that tells you she knows all your secrets. This is the story of Serena, a woman who lost everything, only to find the one thing that truly mattered: herself. The late morning sun streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the penthouse, casting a golden glow on the polished marble floors. Serena Whitmore, 8 months pregnant and feeling every bit of it, traced the rim of her porcelain teacup, the warmth a small comfort against the vast, cool emptiness of the apartment. From this height, New York City was a silent, sprawling map of ambition and dreams, a world her husband, Maxwell, had conquered with ruthless efficiency. Their home was a testament to his success, a minimalist masterpiece of glass, steel, and muted tones curated by a designer who spoke of negative space as if it were a virtue. To Serena, it often just felt empty. She rested a hand on the swell of her belly, a gentle, protective gesture. This baby, their son, was the one vibrant, unpredictable thing in her meticulously ordered life. He was a secret conversation she held throughout the day, a flutter of kicks and turns that reminded her she was more than just Mrs. Maxwell Drake, the elegant, smiling woman on his arm at charity galas and corporate dinners. She was a mother. Her love for Maxwell was a complex tapestry, woven with threads of genuine affection, gratitude, and a quiet, gnawing insecurity. She had met him 5 years ago, a wide-eyed art history graduate working at a small gallery in Chelsea. He had walked in, a whirlwind of charisma and power, and had been captivated by what he called her serene beauty. Her life had transformed overnight. The cramped walk-up apartment, the ramen noodle dinners, the constant worry over student loans. It all vanished, replaced by a world of private jets, couture gowns, and a black Amex card with no conceivable limit. He had given her a fairy tale, and for a long time, she had tried to be the perfect princess. She learned to navigate the treacherous waters of high society, to smile at women who were sizing up her dress and her marriage, to host dinners where the conversation was as sterile as the decor. She managed their homes, the penthouse, the Hamptons estate, the villa in Tuscany, with a quiet competence that Maxwell praised, calling her his anchor. But an anchor, by its very nature, is meant to be unseen, submerged, holding things in place. Lately, the weight of it felt suffocating. The pregnancy had changed things, creating a subtle distance between them. Maxwell was thrilled, of course. He'd already commissioned a nursery that looked like a miniature version of a royal suite, and had spoken at length about legacy, dynasty, and the importance of a Drake heir. Yet he seemed to view her changing body with a kind of detached fascination, as if it were a project he had funded, but whose messy, biological reality was slightly distasteful. He was a man who dealt in acquisitions, mergers, and hostile takeovers. The raw, unpredictable nature of childbirth didn't fit neatly into his portfolio. He'd been working longer hours than ever, consumed by a massive international merger that he claimed would redefine the industry. He would come home late, smelling of expensive cologne and the faint, metallic scent of stress, his mind still buzzing with figures and projections. He would kiss her forehead, ask perfunctorily about her day, and then retreat to his study, the heavy oak door closing with a soft, definitive click. Serena fought the whispers of doubt that crept into her mind in the lonely hours of the night. It was just the stress of the deal, she told herself. It was the hormones of pregnancy making her feel needy and emotional. Maxwell loved her. He had built this perfect world for her, for them. To doubt him felt like a betrayal, a crack in the flawless facade of their life. Today she felt a surge of determination. She wouldn't be a passive anchor. She would be a wife. She would remind him of the woman he'd fallen in love with, not just the vessel carrying his son. She looked at the clock. It was almost noon. On a whim, she decided to surprise him for lunch. She would have their driver take her downtown. She'd pick up his favorite sandwiches from that little Italian deli he loved in Soho, and walk into his office like the confident, cherished wife she was supposed to be. She imagined his face, the initial surprise, the flicker of annoyance at the interruption, quickly replaced by the charming smile he reserved for her. He would sweep the papers off his desk, kiss her deeply, and for an hour, they would just be a husband and wife, excited about their future, about their son. The thought filled her with a warmth that had nothing to do with the tea. She went to their bedroom, the size of her old apartment, and chose a dress, a soft, cream-colored cashmere that was both elegant and comfortable, draping gracefully over her bump. She applied a touch of makeup, just enough to hide the faint shadows of sleeplessness under her eyes. As she looked at her reflection in the vast, gilt-edged mirror, she saw the woman Maxwell had created, poised, beautiful, serene. Today, she would prove to herself and to him that she was more than just a beautiful object in his collection. She was his partner, the mother of his child, the center of his world. With a deep breath, she picked up her purse, a silent prayer in her heart that the man she was going to see was still the man she had married. The lobby of Drake Global was designed to intimidate. It was a cavernous cathedral of commerce, with floors of gleaming black granite that reflected the cold, recessed lighting like a dark, still lake. A massive, abstract sculpture of twisted bronze dominated the center, a piece Maxwell had purchased at auction for a figure that could have funded a small country. The air itself felt different here, filtered, crisp, and humming with a low, electric tension. It was the scent of money and power, a fragrance Serena had learned to recognize but had never grown comfortable with. The security guards at the main desk, men with jawlines as rigid as their posture, greeted her with a practiced, impersonal deference. "Good morning, Mrs. Drake." They knew who she was, yet there was always a flicker of assessment in their eyes, a silent confirmation that she still belonged. "I'm going up to see my husband," she said, her voice softer than she intended. "It's a surprise." One of the guards offered a thin smile and tapped a button on his console. "Of course, he's on a call, but I'm sure he'll be happy to see you." The elevator ride to the 60th floor was a silent, stomach-lurching ascent. Serena clutched the handles of the paper bag containing the sandwiches, the smell of prosciutto and fresh basil, a small, grounding, and utterly out-of-place comfort. She watched the floor numbers flash by, each one a level of Maxwell's empire she rarely saw. His world was up here, in the sky, while hers was in the penthouse, waiting. The elevator doors opened with a soft chime onto a hushed, carpeted reception area. The carpet was a plush, charcoal grey that absorbed all sound, creating an atmosphere of monastic seriousness. Maxwell's executive assistant, a woman named Maria, who had been with him for a decade, was not at her desk. This was unusual. Maria was a fixture, a gatekeeper as formidable as the men downstairs. Her empty chair felt like a missing piece, a disruption in the carefully orchestrated rhythm of the office. A low murmur of voices came from behind the imposing double doors of Maxwell's office. "So, The guard was right. He was on a call. Serena hesitated. Should she wait? The element of surprise was already waning, replaced by a growing sense of unease. The empty reception area, the closed doors. It felt less like an office, and more like a sealed chamber. No, she had come this far. She would not be deterred. She was his wife. She had every right to be here. Straightening her shoulders, she walked quietly to the doors. They were solid oak, heavy and soundproof. She pushed one gently. It swung inward without a sound, a testament to the quality of its craftsmanship. The scene inside froze her in the doorway. Maxwell's office was magnificent, a corner suite with panoramic views of the Hudson River and the Statue of Liberty, a tiny, distant promise of freedom. But Serena's eyes weren't on the view. They were fixed on the person sitting in Maxwell's chair. It wasn't Maxwell. It was a woman. She was lounging in his large, black leather executive chair, her legs, long and clad in sleek black trousers, propped casually up on the edge of his massive mahogany desk. One of his prized crystal whiskey glasses, half full of amber liquid, was sweating onto a stack of confidential-looking documents. The woman held a phone to her ear. But she wasn't speaking. She was listening, a small, knowing smirk playing on her lips. She was young, with sharp, angular features, and a mane of dark, glossy hair that fell over the shoulders of a crisp, white silk blouse. She looked like she belonged there, like the chair and the desk and the power were all hers. And Maxwell. Maxwell was standing by the window, his back to the door, his shoulders tense. He was speaking in a low, urgent tone, the voice he used when a deal was on the verge of collapsing. "No, you don't understand," he was saying, his voice tight with a frustration she had never heard directed at a business associate. "It's not that simple. You can't just... You have to be patient." He turned then, sensing a change in the room, and his eyes met Serena's. For a split second, his face was a mask of pure, unadulterated panic. The blood drained from his cheeks, leaving his skin a pasty, greyish colour. His mouth fell slightly open, his words cut off mid-sentence. It was a look of such profound guilt that it struck Serena with the force of a physical blow. The woman in the chair followed his gaze. Her smirk widened into a slow, deliberate smile. She didn't move her feet from the desk. She didn't put down the whiskey glass. She simply looked Serena up and down, her eyes lingering for a moment on the swell of her pregnant belly, a flicker of something. Amusement. Contempt in their dark depths. Then she slowly, deliberately ended her call and placed the phone on the desk beside her. The silence that descended on the room was deafening. It was thick with everything unsaid, with the shattering of illusions and the birth of a terrible new reality. The smell of prosciutto and basil from the bag in Serena's hand suddenly seemed nauseatingly inappropriate, a relic from a life that had ceased to exist the moment she pushed open that door. Her heart, which had been beating with nervous anticipation, now felt like a cold, heavy stone in her chest. She had come to surprise her husband, to reconnect with the man she loved. But the man by the window was a stranger, and the woman in his chair looked more at home than Serena ever had. The world seemed to tilt on its axis, the panoramic view of the city blurring into a meaningless smear of grey and blue. Serena's hand, the one clutching the lunch bag, trembled so violently that the paper crinkled, the sound unnaturally loud in the suffocating silence. Her mind struggled to process the scene, to fit it into any logical framework, but there was no logic here, only a raw, visceral betrayal that bypassed thought and went straight for the heart. Maxwell. The name came out as a whisper, a fragile, broken thing. Maxwell finally moved, taking a step toward her, his hands raised in a placating gesture, as if approaching a frightened animal. "Serena, darling, what are you doing here?" The question was so absurd, so utterly inadequate for the moment, that a bubble of hysterical laughter threatened to rise in her throat. "What are you doing here? I live with you. I'm carrying your child. I brought you a sandwich." The thoughts screamed in her head, but her lips couldn't form the words. I came to surprise you," she managed, her voice trembling. Her eyes flickered from his pale, panicked face to the woman in his chair. The woman hadn't moved. She was watching them like one might watch a particularly engrossing play, a hint of boredom in her posture, as if she were waiting for the real action to begin. "Who is she?" Serena asked, the words finally finding their strength, sharp and clear. Maxwell's eyes darted nervously toward the woman. "This is Cassandra. Cassandra Vale. She's a consultant, working on the merger." The lie was so flimsy, so transparent, it was an insult. Consultants didn't put their feet up on the CEO's desk. They didn't drink his private stock of whiskey at noon. They didn't look at the CEO's pregnant wife with such brazen ownership. Cassandra Vale finally decided to join the conversation. She swung her legs off the desk, her movements fluid and unhurried. She stood up, revealing a tall, whip-thin figure that seemed to radiate a predatory energy. She was everything Serena was not. Sharp where Serena was soft, dark where Serena was fair, overtly confident where Serena was quietly reserved. "Consultant is such a sterile term, don't you think?" Cassandra said, her voice a low, husky purr. She picked up the whiskey glass and swirled the contents, her eyes never leaving Serena's. "I'd say I'm more of a partner, in a manner of speaking." The insinuation hung in the air, thick and poisonous. Serena felt the blood rush to her face, a hot wave of humiliation and rage. She looked at Maxwell, pleading with her eyes for him to deny it, to say something, to fix this nightmare. But Maxwell just stood there, trapped between the two women, his usual aura of command completely gone, replaced by the pathetic indecision of a cornered man. "Cassandra, don't," he said weakly. "Don't what, Maxwell?" Cassandra shot back, her voice suddenly sharp, all pretense of purring gone. "Don't state the obvious? Your wife is standing right here. She's not an idiot. Are you, Serena?" She directed the question at Serena, her head tilted in a gesture of mock curiosity. "You must have suspected something. A man like Maxwell with his appetites. Did you really think you were enough to keep him satisfied?" Each word was a carefully aimed dart, and they all hit their mark. Serena flinched, the bag in her hand finally slipping from her grasp. The sandwiches, the symbols of her naive, hopeful gesture, hit the plush carpet with a soft, pathetic thud. She wrapped her arms around her belly, a primal, protective instinct taking over. The baby chose that moment to kick, a hard, insistent jab against her ribs, as if he too could sense the poison in the room. "Get out," Serena said, her voice low and shaking with a fury she didn't know she possessed. She was speaking to Cassandra, but her eyes were locked on Maxwell. Cassandra laughed, a short, sharp, ugly sound. "I don't think I'm the one who needs to leave. I'm in the middle of a very important consultation." She walked around the desk and perched on the edge, crossing her arms. She had claimed the territory. This was her ground now. Serena turned her full attention to her husband. The shock was beginning to recede, replaced by a cold, terrifying clarity. She saw him not as the powerful, charismatic man she had fallen in love with, but as he was in this moment, weak, cowardly, and deceitful. "Maxwell, tell her to get out of your office. Now." Her voice didn't waver. He looked from Serena's stony face to Cassandra's mocking one. He ran a hand through his perfectly styled hair, messing it up for the first time she could ever remember. "Look, both of you. Let's just be calm," he began, his voice taking on a tone of strained reason that was utterly maddening. "Serena, this is not what it looks like." "Not what it looks like?" Serena's voice rose, cracking with disbelief. "She is sitting in your chair, drinking your whiskey, talking about your appetites. My God, Maxwell, do you think I'm a fool? How long?" The question hung in the air. Maxwell's silence was the only answer she needed. It wasn't new. It wasn't a mistake. This was a life he was living, parallel to hers. "How long?" she repeated, stepping closer to him, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. He wouldn't meet her eyes. He stared at a point on the wall just over her shoulder. "It's complicated, Elle. The merger, she's connected to the other side. It was strategic at first. Strategic. The word was so cold, so clinical. He was talking about his infidelity as if it were a line item in a business plan. The betrayal was one thing. The casual, dismissive justification of it was another. It broke something deep inside her. "Strategic," she repeated, the word tasting like ash in her mouth. She looked down at her swollen belly. "And was this part of your strategy too? Was bringing a child into this lie part of the deal?" For the first time, a flicker of genuine shame crossed his face. "No, of course not. Elle, you have to believe me. I love you. This, with Cassandra, it's just—" "Don't you dare say it's just sex," Cassandra interjected, pushing off the desk. "Don't insult both of us with that cliché. What Maxwell and I have is a partnership. We understand each other. We operate on the same level. We don't hide in a penthouse, arranging flowers and waiting for our husband to come home." The final, cruel jab was aimed directly at Serena's greatest insecurity, her fear of being nothing more than a decorative part of Maxwell's life. And it came from the woman who had usurped her place, not just in his bed, but in his chair, in the very seat of his power. Serena felt a sudden, dizzying wave of nausea. The air was too thick, the scent of Cassandra's cloying perfume mixing with the whiskey and the stale air of deceit. She had to get out. She couldn't breathe. Without another word, she turned and walked out of the office, her back straight, her head held high. She didn't run. She didn't cry. Not yet. She walked past the empty reception desk, her footsteps silent on the thick carpet. She pressed the button for the elevator, her hand steady. She would not give them the satisfaction of seeing her fall apart. Not here. The breakdown could come later, in the sterile silence of the gilded cage Maxwell had built for her. As the elevator door slid shut, sealing her in the mirrored box, she finally met her own eyes in the reflection. The serene, poised woman from this morning was gone. In her place was a stranger with haunted eyes and a shattered heart, a woman who had just walked through the looking glass and found that her entire world was a lie. The journey down 60 floors was a descent into a new kind of hell. The mirrored walls of the elevator reflected 1,000 images of a woman she no longer recognized. Her face was a pale, blank mask, her eyes wide with a shock so profound it had yet to curdle into pain. The city, once a symbol of her husband's triumph, now seemed menacing, its towering structures pressing in on her, mocking her naivete. When the doorman held the door of the penthouse open for her, his cheerful, "Welcome home, Mrs. Drake," felt like a cruel joke. Home? This place wasn't a home. It was a stage set, and she had just discovered she was the only actor who hadn't been given the real script. She walked through the vast, sunlit living room, the negative space now feeling like a physical presence, a void that mirrored the one that had just been carved into her chest. She went straight to their bedroom and closed the door, the soft click echoing the sound of Maxwell's study door, the one that had so often shut her out. Now, she was the one closing the door. For hours she just sat on the edge of their perfectly made king-sized bed, her hands resting on her belly. The baby was quiet now, as if sensing her distress. The silence of the penthouse was absolute. There were no children's toys scattered on the floor, no clutter of a life lived, only the hum of the climate control and the distant, muted sirens of the city below. It was an echo chamber, and the only sounds were the ricocheting fragments of the scene in the office. Cassandra's husky voice, her mocking laughter, Maxwell's weak excuses, the pathetic thud of the sandwiches hitting the floor. The pain, when it finally came, was not a storm. It was a slow, creeping flood. It started in her toes and rose steadily, a cold tide of grief and humiliation. It filled her lungs until she couldn't breathe. And then, finally, the tears came. They were not the loud, cathartic sobs of a simple heartbreak. They were silent, scalding tears that traced paths down her cheeks and dripped onto the expensive cashmere of her dress. She cried for the woman she had been that morning, so full of hope and love. She cried for the baby inside her, who would be born into a fractured world. And she cried for the 5 years of her life that now felt like a grand deception. Every memory was now tainted. Their wedding in Lake Como, which she had thought was the most romantic day of her life, now seemed like the opening scene of a tragedy. The tender moments, the shared laughter, the promises whispered in the dark. Were they all lies? Or worse, were they real for her, but just part of a strategy for him? The thought was a fresh stab of pain. He had compartmentalized her, their marriage, their unborn child. She was the domestic portfolio, while Cassandra was the high-risk, high-reward venture. As dusk fell, casting long, lonely shadows across the room, the grief began to harden into something else. It was a cold, hard knot of anger. Anger at Maxwell for his betrayal and his cowardice. Anger at Cassandra for her cruelty and her arrogance. But most of all, a searing, unfamiliar anger at herself. Cassandra's words echoed in her mind. Did you really think you were enough? For years, Serena had pushed that question down. She had accepted the gilded cage because she had been afraid that without it, she was nothing. She had allowed herself to become dependent, to let her own ambitions and desires atrophy, while she focused on being the perfect wife to a powerful man. She had traded her own substance for his shadow. Cassandra hadn't just taken her husband. She had held up a mirror to Serena's own complicity in her erasure. She stood up and walked to the window, looking down at the city lights twinkling to life. The city didn't care about her broken heart. It was a relentless engine of ambition, a place where people like Maxwell and Cassandra thrived. They saw vulnerability as a weakness to be exploited. They saw trust as a liability. A new resolve began to form. Fragile at first, but persistent. She would not be a victim in this story. She would not crumble. She had a son to think about, a son she would not raise in the shadow of this deceit. He deserved a mother who was whole, a mother who was strong. He deserved more than a life in a beautiful, empty penthouse built on a foundation of lies. Her mind, which had been foggy with shock, began to clear. She started to think, not as a heartbroken wife, but as a survivor. Maxwell had called his affair strategic. The word, once so painful, now became a key. He thought in terms of power, leverage, and assets. Fine. She would learn to think that way too. She walked into Maxwell's cavernous walk-in closet, a space filled with rows of bespoke suits and handmade Italian shoes. This was the armor of the man who had betrayed her. On his valet stand was the watch he had worn today, a Patek Philippe worth more than her parents' house. Beside it, his wallet and keys. She picked up the wallet. Inside, behind his driver's license and a photo of them from their honeymoon, the irony was sickening, was a business card she had never seen before. It was for a law firm, one she didn't recognize. Hadley & Stern, Private Wealth Management and Asset Protection. Why would Maxwell have this? Their official family lawyers were a well-known white shoe firm. This felt different, secretive. She slipped the card into the pocket of her dress. It felt heavy, like a weapon. Then she went to his study. The door was unlocked. The room was his sanctuary, a place of dark wood, leather-bound books, and the faint smell of cigars. She had always respected his privacy, never dreaming of going through his things. That respect was gone, burned away in the heat of his betrayal. She sat down in his chair, the real one, the one Cassandra had so brazenly occupied, and turned on his computer. It was password protected, of course. She tried their anniversary. Nothing. She tried her birthday. Nothing. Then, with a bitter, hollow feeling, she typed in the name of the merger he was so obsessed with. Ethelred. The screen flickered and opened onto his desktop. The ease with which it opened, the fact that his password was the name of his grand ambition and not anything related to her or their life together, was the final, definitive confirmation. She had never been at the center of his world. She had merely been orbiting it. For the next hour, she didn't look for love letters or incriminating photos. She looked for financial statements, legal documents, emails related to Hadley & Stern. She was no longer a wife looking for an explanation for a broken heart. She was an adversary, gathering intelligence. The gilded cage had become a battlefield, and she was just beginning to learn the rules of engagement. The days that followed were a masterclass in deception. Serena played the part of the wounded, retreating wife, a role Maxwell seemed not only to expect, but to prefer. He had come home that first night, his face a mask of contrition, armed with apologies that sounded rehearsed and excuses that were insulting. He'd tried to touch her, to hold her, but she had flinched away as if from a hot flame, and the chasm between them had solidified into a cold, unbridgeable reality. He didn't push. He gave her space, retreating to a guest room, treating her with a gentle, kid-glove solicitude that grated on her nerves. He brought her meals she didn't eat, asked about her doctor's appointments, and spoke of the baby in hushed, reverent tones, as if their son could somehow be the bridge back to what they had lost. He thought her silence was grief, her withdrawal a sign of a broken heart that he could, in time, mend with expensive gifts and patient promises. He had no idea that her silence was a crucible, burning away the last of her weakness and forging something new and hard in its place. While Maxwell was at his office, presumably continuing his strategic partnership with Cassandra, Serena was at war. Her first call was not to one of the high-powered, aggressive divorce attorneys whose names were whispered at every society luncheon. Her situation was more complex. She needed discretion. She needed a strategist. She needed someone who understood the rarefied world of men like Maxwell Drake. She called the number on the business card she'd found in his wallet. Hadley & Stern. "I need to speak with Mr. Callahan," she said, her voice calm and even when a receptionist answered. "My name is Serena Drake." There was a brief pause, then a smooth, professional voice. "Mr. Callahan is in a meeting. May I ask the nature of your call?" "Tell him it concerns Maxwell Drake," Serena said. "And tell him I know he's Maxwell's asset protection attorney. I'm Maxwell's wife. I think he'll want to take my call." The bluff was a shot in the dark, based on a hunch and the firm's secretive nature. It worked. Less than a minute later, a new voice was on the line, calm and measured. "This is Edward Callahan. How can I help you, Mrs. Drake?" "Mr. Callahan," Serena began, "I believe you are familiar with my husband's financial portfolio. I have reason to believe he is not the only one in our marriage who may soon require asset protection." There was another pause, this one longer, filled with the silent hum of calculation. "I see," Callahan said finally. "My fiduciary duty is to my client, Mrs. Drake. I cannot discuss his affairs with you." "I'm not asking you to," Serena countered, her heart pounding. "I'm not calling about Maxwell. I'm calling about me. I would like to retain your services." This, she knew, was a gamble. A lawyer couldn't represent both sides of a conflict. By approaching him, she was forcing him to choose, or at the very least, creating a conflict of interest that would neutralize him. "That would be highly irregular," Callahan said, his voice betraying a flicker of surprise. "My husband is a highly irregular man," Serena replied. "I'm learning I have to be too. I'm not filing for divorce. Not yet. I'm gathering information. I want to know exactly what I am entitled to. I want to understand the prenuptial agreement I signed 5 years ago when I was too young and too in love to read the fine print. And I want to know what happens to my son's future if his father's strategic partnerships prove to be financially, as well as morally, bankrupt." She had his attention. They scheduled a meeting for the following day at a discreet hotel lounge in Midtown. Edward "Ed" Callahan was a small, neat man in his late 60s, with kind eyes that belied a razor-sharp mind. He listened patiently as Serena, leaving out the raw emotional details, recounted the scene in Maxwell's office and her discovery of his password and the hidden legal and financial documents. She had spent the last 2 nights poring over them, using the cold fury that had settled in her heart to fuel her concentration. When she was finished, Callahan steepled his fingers and looked at her with a newfound respect. "You were right to come to me, Mrs. Drake, and you are right to be concerned. I cannot, of course, represent you, but I can, as a courtesy, offer you some perspective." He proceeded to give her a crash course in the brutal realities of her marriage. The prenuptial agreement she had signed was an ironclad fortress designed by Maxwell and his lawyers to protect his vast, premarital fortune. In the event of a divorce, she would be entitled to a settlement that, while generous by any normal standard, was a pittance compared to his actual worth. It was designed to allow her to live comfortably, but not powerfully. It would keep her out of his world. But then Callahan pointed out the one thing Maxwell hadn't anticipated. "The prenup was signed before the conception of a child," he explained, his eyes gleaming with professional interest. "The birth of a Drake heir changes the dynamic considerably. The provisions for child support, for the child's lifestyle, inheritance, and security, these are not so easily capped. A child, Mrs. Drake, is not an asset to be protected. He is a legacy to be provided for, and the courts take that very, very seriously." He gave her the name of another lawyer, a woman named Genevieve Hart. "She's a shark," Callahan said, a hint of a smile on his lips. "But she's my shark. She's the best matrimonial lawyer in this city, and she specializes in taking down men who think their money makes them invincible. Tell her I sent you. And Mrs. Drake," he added as she stood to leave, "underestimate your husband's sentimentality, but do not underestimate his ruthlessness. He will fight to keep his son, and he will fight to keep his money. Be prepared." The meeting with Genevieve Hart was entirely different. She was a whirlwind of energy, a woman who spoke in rapid-fire sentences and radiated an impatient intelligence. She listened to Serena's story, her sharp eyes missing nothing. "Good," she said, when Serena was done. "You're angry. Anger is a better fuel than tears. Now, Here's what we're going to do. We do nothing. Not yet. We continue to gather information. You are in the perfect position. The grieving, pregnant wife. He'll be careless. He'll be so focused on managing Cassandra and his big-shot merger that he'll get sloppy. I want you to document everything. Every late night, every suspicious credit card charge, every conversation. Become a ghost in your own home. Listen. Observe. And most importantly, Genevieve said, leaning forward, her voice dropping, find out everything you can about Cassandra Vale. Who is she? Where did she come from? What does she really want? In my experience, women like that are never just about sex or love. They're about something else. Find out what it is. Serena left the lawyer's office feeling as if she had been given a new spine, one made of steel. The path ahead was terrifying, a minefield of legal and emotional challenges. But for the first time since she'd walked into Maxwell's office, she felt a flicker of power. She had a plan. She had allies. She was no longer just a victim of her husband's betrayal. She was an active participant in its consequences. The rules of engagement had been set, and she was finally ready to play the game. For 2 weeks, Serena lived a double life. To Maxwell, she was a ghost, haunting the edges of his world, her grief a silent, ever-present reproach. She was pale, quiet, and compliant, the very picture of a woman broken. He continued his clumsy attempts at reconciliation, leaving extravagant gifts on her pillow. A diamond necklace she left in its box. First-class tickets to Paris she left on the counter. He saw her sorrow as a temporary state, a wound that time and money would eventually heal. He had no idea her passivity was a camouflage, her silence a weapon. By night, she was a detective. Fueled by Genevieve Hart's mandate, she delved into the digital life Maxwell had so carelessly left open to her. She became an expert at navigating his encrypted files and offshore accounts, her art history background giving her a surprising aptitude for deciphering patterns and finding hidden connections. But her primary focus was Cassandra Vale. The woman had almost no digital footprint. There were no gushing social media profiles, no tagged photos from college parties. It was as if she had been born 5 years ago, fully formed and ready for corporate warfare. The lack of information was, in itself, a red flag. In an age of oversharing, a deliberate absence was a statement. Serena hired a discreet private investigator, a former NYPD detective Genevieve had recommended. Within days, the first pieces of the puzzle began to arrive in a plain manila envelope. Cassandra Vale was not her real name. She was born Zoya Chernov in a bleak industrial city in post-Soviet Russia. Her father was a low-level apparatchik who had disappeared under mysterious circumstances. She had come to the United States on a student visa a decade ago, studying economics at Columbia, where she had distinguished herself for her fierce intelligence and even fiercer ambition. The most interesting part, however, was her employment history. For the past 3 years, she had been a senior associate at Sterling Finch, the very company Maxwell was trying to merge with. Or rather, the company he was trying to acquire in a deal that was becoming increasingly hostile. Serena sat in the sterile silence of the penthouse. The investigator's report spread across the dining table. The pieces clicked into place with a sickening certainty. Cassandra wasn't a random affair. She wasn't a consultant. She was a corporate spy. The merger wasn't a collaboration. It was a war. And Maxwell, blinded by his arrogance and his appetites, had invited the enemy's top soldier into his bed, into his office, into the very heart of his strategy. Cassandra hadn't just been sleeping with him. She had been bleeding him dry, feeding every piece of proprietary information, every negotiation tactic, every financial vulnerability, back to her real employers at Sterling Finch. Maxwell thought he was playing her. In reality, he was the pawn. The revelation sent a chill down Serena's spine that had nothing to do with heartbreak. This was bigger than infidelity. This was about the potential ruin of everything Maxwell had built. The power imbalance she had felt so acutely was a sham. Cassandra wasn't just a mistress trying to usurp a wife. She was an operative on a mission to destroy a king, and Maxwell had handed her the keys to the kingdom. The knowledge was a heavy, dangerous weight. What should she do with it? Her first instinct, the instinct of the woman she used to be, was to run to Maxwell, to warn him, to save him from his own folly. The thought of his empire crumbling, the foundation of her life for the past 5 years, was terrifying, but Genevieve Hart's voice echoed in her mind. Anger is a better fuel than tears. The part of her that had been forged in the fire of her humiliation hesitated. Why should she save him? He had been ready to risk everything, her dignity, their marriage, the security of their unborn child, for a sordid affair. He had lied, and lied, and lied again. If he was brought down by the very weapon he had chosen to betray her with, wasn't that a form of justice? She was wrestling with this moral quandary late one night when Maxwell came home, looking more stressed and exhausted than she had ever seen him. The swagger was gone. He loosened his tie as he walked in, his shoulders slumped in defeat. "They're pulling out," he said, his voice rough. He didn't seem to be talking to her, but to the empty room. "Sterling Finch, they just torpedoed the deal. They countered with an offer to acquire us. They knew our bottom line, Elle. They knew exactly where to hit us." He finally looked at her, his eyes hollow with desperation. "Someone leaked the data. It had to be an inside job. I'm ruined." Serena's heart hammered against her ribs. Here it was. The moment of truth. She held all the cards. She could expose Cassandra, play the role of the loyal, forgiving wife, and perhaps salvage some part of their life together from the wreckage. Or she could stay silent and watch him fall. She thought of her son. What life would he have if his father was a disgraced, bankrupt man? But what life would he have if his mother taught him that betrayal has no consequences, that love means silently accepting lies? "I know who it was," she said, her voice quiet but clear. Maxwell stared at her, his face a mixture of confusion and disbelief. "What? What are you talking about?" "The leak," she said, standing up to face him, her hand resting on her belly like a shield. It was Cassandra. He looked as if she had slapped him. "Cassandra! No, that's impossible. She works for me." "Does she, Maxwell?" Serena asked, her voice dripping with a cold irony she hadn't known she was capable of. "Or does she work for Sterling Finch? Her real name is Zoya Chernoff. You should have your security team do a more thorough background check next time you decide to strategically sleep with the opposition." The color drained from his face as the truth of her words crashed down on him. He stumbled back, sinking into one of the expensive, uncomfortable armchairs. He looked small, suddenly, defeated. The master of the universe, brought low by a consultant. How did you know?" he whispered, staring at her as if seeing her for the first time. "While you were busy underestimating me, I decided to stop underestimating myself," she said simply. "I have the proof, Maxwell, a full report, enough to not only expose her, but to file a corporate espionage lawsuit that would cripple Sterling Finch and probably save your company." Hope flickered in his eyes, pathetic and desperate. "Serena, my God, you have to give it to me. We can fix this. You can fix this." Serena looked at the man she had once loved, the man who had shattered her world without a second thought, now begging her to save his. The power, all of it, was finally in her hands. "I can," she agreed, her voice soft. "But I haven't decided if I will. My help comes with a price, and it's not a price you can pay with money." She let the words hang in the air, a devil's bargain in the heart of the gilded cage. He had taught her that everything was a transaction. Now, she would finally set her own terms. The penthouse, once a symbol of Maxwell's power, became a negotiation room. The negative space was now charged with a palpable tension, the vast windows reflecting a city that seemed to be holding its breath. Maxwell, the titan of industry, was reduced to a supplicant, his fate resting in the hands of the woman he had so carelessly discarded. He had spent his life in boardrooms, dominating negotiations through sheer force of will. But the rules were different here. The currency was not money or power, but trust and pain, and he was bankrupt. He made promises, of course. He would fire Cassandra. He already had, in a furious, impotent phone call. He would never see her again. He would dedicate his life to making it up to Serena, to their son. He would go to therapy, sell the company, do anything she wanted. The words tumbled out of him, a desperate, chaotic flood of remorse. Serena listened, her expression unreadable. She let him talk, let him exhaust his arsenal of pleas and pledges. She had heard his promises before. They were as worthless as the shares of his company would be in a week's time. "I don't want your promises, Maxwell," she said when he finally fell silent, his voice hoarse. "I want your signature." She slid a folder across the polished surface of the dining table. It wasn't the investigator's report on Cassandra. It was a new document, drafted by Genevieve Hart in a marathon 24-hour session. "What is this?" he asked, his hand trembling slightly as he reached for it. "It's a post-nuptial agreement," Serena said, her voice as cool and hard as the marble beneath their feet. "It supersedes the document I signed when I was 22. This one is a little different. It's not about what I get if we divorce. It's about what I get and what our son gets, right now." Maxwell opened the folder. His face, already pale, turned ashen as he read. The terms were brutal, precise, and non-negotiable. 51% of Drake Global's voting shares were to be transferred into an irrevocable trust for their son, with Serena as the sole trustee until the child reached the age of 25. The penthouse, the Hamptons estate, and the villa in Tuscany were to be signed over to her, free and clear. A significant portion of his liquid assets was to be moved into a separate account under her exclusive control. In essence, she was demanding control of his company, his homes, and his fortune. She was not just asking for a safety net, she was taking the throne. This is everything," he stammered, looking up at her, his eyes wide with disbelief. "You're trying to ruin me." "No, Maxwell," she corrected him calmly. "You were already ruined. I'm just restructuring the assets." She threw his own business jargon back at him, and the barb hit its mark. "You taught me that all relationships are strategic. This is my strategy. You will continue to run the company day to day. You're good at that. But I will have ultimate control. Our son's future will no longer be dependent on your appetites." He stared at her, a storm of emotions warring on his face, fury, humiliation, and a dawning, horrified respect. This was not the soft, serene woman he had married. This was a queen, coolly and calmly seizing power. This was a move he would have admired in a business rival. To have it executed by his own wife was a checkmate he had never seen coming. "And if I don't sign?" he asked, his voice a low growl. Serena didn't flinch. She gestured to another folder on the table, the one containing the evidence against Cassandra and Sterling Finch. "If you don't sign, this report gets leaked to the press. Not to your lawyers, not to the board. to the Wall Street Journal. Your company collapses. Sterling Finch gets investigated for corporate espionage, but the damage to your reputation will be irreversible. You will lose everything, and you will have nothing to offer our son but a legacy of failure and scandal. If you sign, however, I will give you the evidence you need to countersue Sterling Finch. You will be seen as the victim of a honey trap, a brilliant CEO who was targeted but ultimately triumphed. You'll save your company. You'll save your reputation. You'll just lose your crown. It was a masterful trap, and they both knew it. She was offering him the one thing he couldn't stand to lose, his public image, his legacy, in exchange for the one thing he had always taken for granted, his power over her. He spent the next hour pacing the length of the penthouse, a caged tiger wrestling with the impossible. He argued, he threatened, he pleaded. He tried to appeal to her love, to their history, to the baby. But he was firing blanks. The woman he was trying to manipulate no longer existed. Finally, defeated, he slumped back down at the table. "You'll have your own lawyers look at this, of course," Serena said, her voice devoid of triumph. This wasn't a victory lap. It was a business transaction. "What's the point?" he said bitterly. "You've thought of everything." He picked up a pen, his hand still shaking, and signed the document that effectively handed his life's work over to his wife. As soon as the ink was dry, Serena pushed the second folder toward him. "Here is the information on Cassandra Vale and Sterling Finch. I suggest you give it to your legal team immediately. The clock is ticking." She stood up. The deal concluded. The power in the room had irrevocably shifted. It no longer resided with the man who had built the penthouse, but with the woman who was about to turn it into her own fortress. She walked toward the bedroom, her hand on her belly, feeling the weight of her new responsibility. She had not done this out of revenge, she realized, or not only out of revenge. She had done it for the life kicking inside her. She had secured his future, not with a philandering, reckless father, but with a mother who had learned, the hard way, how to protect her own. The gilded cage was hers now, but the door was wide open. She was the one holding the key. In the weeks that followed, the financial world was rocked by the saga of Drake Global and Sterling Finch. The story that played out in the business pages was one of corporate espionage and betrayal, a cautionary tale of a CEO targeted by a ruthless competitor. Maxwell Drake, the narrative went, was the victim of a sophisticated honey trap, but in a brilliant countermove, he had exposed the plot and launched a lawsuit that not only saved his company, but positioned it for an even more powerful future. He was lauded for his resilience, his strategic genius. No one knew that the true strategist was his quiet, pregnant wife, watching the news from a penthouse that was now legally hers. Maxwell, stripped of his ultimate authority, but left with his public pride, threw himself into the legal battle with a vengeance. He was a man with a purpose again, and Serena let him have it. It was, she knew, the only way for him to function. Their interactions were clipped, professional. They were no longer husband and wife, but partners in a strange, fractured enterprise, the co-management of a corporation and the co-parenting of a child who had not yet been born. The penthouse, once a symbol of her confinement, transformed under her direction. The cold, minimalist decor was gradually replaced. A plush, comfortable sofa replaced the angular designer piece. Shelves were filled not with art books chosen to impress, but with novels she loved, and soon with children's books. The negative space was filled with the warmth and clutter of a life being lived, not just displayed. She was nesting, not as a dependent wife, but as the matriarch of her own domain. 2 months later, Serena gave birth to a healthy baby boy. She named him Christian, a name she chose herself, a name with no dynastic weight or corporate significance. It was simply a name she liked. Maxwell was there for the birth, a nervous, hovering presence in the hospital room. When he held his son for the first time, something in his face broke. The arrogance, the calculation, the bitterness. It all fell away, replaced by a raw, unguarded vulnerability that Serena had not seen since the early days of their relationship. He wept, quiet tears of profound, gut-wrenching regret. In that moment, watching him cradle their son, Serena felt the last, hard knot of her anger begin to dissolve. It was not replaced by forgiveness, not in the simple, fairy tale sense. The trust was gone forever. The love she had felt was a thing of the past, but in its place was a complex, weary empathy. She saw him not as a monster, but as a flawed, broken man who had almost lost everything due to his own weakness, and who was only now beginning to understand the true cost. Their new life took on a strange, quiet rhythm. Maxwell was a devoted, if hesitant, father. He would come home from the office, an office he ran, but which she owned, and his first stop would be the nursery. He learned to change diapers, to warm bottles, to walk the floors at 3 a.m. with a crying baby. These small acts of service were his penance, his attempt to rebuild, not their marriage, but some form of human connection. Serena, for her part, blossomed. Motherhood suited her. But it was more than that. The security she now had was not something that had been given to her. It was something she had seized. She sat on the board of Drake Global, her voice quiet but firm, her insights surprisingly sharp. She had learned the business from the inside out, and her decisions were guided by a fierce, maternal instinct to protect her son's legacy. She never flaunted her power over Maxwell. She never reminded him of the post-nuptial agreement locked in a safe. She didn't have to. It was the new reality that underpinned their entire existence. One evening, about a year after Christian was born, she was sitting in the living room, reading a story to her son, who was babbling happily in her lap. Maxwell came and stood in the doorway, watching them. The setting sun cast a warm, golden light into the room, a light that felt entirely different from the cold, gilded glow of her old life. "He looks like you," Maxwell said quietly. "He has your eyes," Serena replied without looking up. He walked over and sat, not next to her, but on the ottoman across from her, creating a respectful distance. "I've been thinking a lot," he said, his voice low, "about what I did, about what I lost. It wasn't just the company or the money. I lost my moral compass. I lost you. And I almost lost him before he was even here." He finally said the words she had once longed to hear, but which she no longer needed. "I am so sorry, Serena." For everything, she looked at him then, truly looked at him. The apology was real. The remorse was genuine. It had taken him a year of quiet desperation and fatherhood to get there. "I know you are, Maxwell," she said softly. And she did. It was not a promise of reconciliation. It was not an erasure of the past. It was an acknowledgement of a shared, painful history and a fragile, uncertain future. She would never be the naive girl who had fallen for a charismatic millionaire. And he would never be the untouchable king who believed he could have it all. Her redemption had not come from his apology, but from her own actions. She had found her strength not by leaving him, but by redefining the terms of her life with him. She had walked into his office, a pregnant, trusting wife, and had been shattered. But from those broken pieces, she had built a fortress, not of glass and steel, but of her own resilience. She had discovered that the most valuable asset she would ever control was not a global corporation, but her own hard-won independence. The cage was gone, and in its place was a home, filled with a different kind of gold. The quiet, priceless warmth of a mother and her son, secure in a world of their own making. Serena's journey shows us that sometimes the deepest betrayals can lead to the most profound transformations. She walked into that office as a wife and walked out as a warrior, fighting not just for her dignity, but for the future of her unborn child. Her story is a powerful reminder that true strength isn't about the life someone gives you, but about the one you have the courage to build for yourself, even from the ashes of a broken heart. What did you think of Serena's ultimate decision? Was it justice, or was it cold-hearted revenge? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. If you were moved by this story of betrayal, empowerment, and redemption, please give this video a like, share it with someone who loves a powerful story, and don't forget to subscribe for more emotional fiction that feels like real life.